And now we're over to New York, where it's now well into the morning, and we have Curtis Hougland, who is waiting for us. So Curtis is the founder and CEO of Mainstreet One, a leading technology-driven communications consultancy in New York. Mainstreet One works for corporates, NGOs, cause marketers, and extensively for political leaders in the USA, delivering messages people are ready to believe, delivered by messengers they already trust. So Curtis, please go on.
Okay, Ken, I would like to start. Can everybody hear me and see me?
That's perfect. Thank you, Curtis.
I feel like that was from the musical Tommy, if anyone would like to travel down memory lane with me. Okay, let's do this. So I think what we have is something unusual. So what I'm going to talk about today is how I think the entirety of marketing, from retail to CPG to pharma, has fundamentally changed as a result of extremism around the globe. So in short, how ISIS, Russia, and the alt-right reinvented what we all do as marketers today. So I'm going to lay out a little bit of a case based on our somewhat unique history, and then walk you through how it works in practice. And then I think what I would encourage everybody to do is post questions into the chat, which I'm going to leave some time at the end to get to, because I think we are going to get into some unusual territories for us as marketers and how we sort of go about thinking about this. At the onset, just to establish some bona fides, I started one of the first new media marketing agencies in the early 90s, one of the first social marketing agencies in the early aughts. And I think for us, though, the story gets interesting around 2013, when we realized the internet was maybe something that we hadn't anticipated it was before. It wasn't a self-repairing system. And so we were recruited and given a grant by Google, Facebook, and Microsoft to stand up an organization whose purpose was to mitigate the recruitment of ISIS and see if we could slow down the impact of its propaganda, and got a front row seat at what we now call the information wars. From there, the US government, including NSA and the research and development arm of the Pentagon, hired us to do a similar thing as to how do we reduce the impact of Russian digital interference in Western democracies, as well as democracies around the globe, including like Indonesia. And so we got a front row seat as to how this playbook of how the internet was being weaponized had been written by ISIS and now professionalized by DARPA. And then 2016, there was an election in the United States that was somewhat dramatic and quite changing to our society. And so we found ourselves compelled to enter the political fray by taking some of our learning, countering ISIS and Russian propaganda, to how we understood the political discourse. And we worked for anywhere from Biden-Harris to Planned Parenthood to Black Lives Matter to the Latino Victory Fund, in how we sort of understood the currents of the internet and what could actually be due to change people's hearts and minds to get at the vote in advance of the 2020 election. Right now, in addition to our commercial work we're doing, we are working across the globe in places like Ukraine, UK, and states in the US, such as Maine, Oregon, Georgia, cities like LA, organizations like the Ad Council and NBA, to promote and try to overcome vaccine hesitancy around the world, to see if we can convince hesitant, skeptical populations that says that it's in their best interest to take the vaccine. And so if you take all that, you might land at the point, well, what does that have to do with marketing? Bear with me 1 second. And so what we're going to do is now take away some lessons that we learned from each one of those. So for ISIS, I'm going to take away a message or a point about trusted messages. And if you think about it, if anybody's read the playbook that ISIS published, I think came out around 2015, you looked at it and go, boy, I don't know this many brands that are that smart about digital marketing. Because what they were really doing, if you peeled back the onions, was they were continuously A/B testing messages at real speed. And when you pulled it all back, there was about 40 individuals that were throwing spaghetti out every single day. And what they essentially were doing is taking that as A/B testing, using some basic social listening, lots and lots of peer-to-peer content, which they were using to find what scabs they could pick, especially in Western society. And if you start to think about what they were really doing, is they were really trying to continuously find what messages were performing, but not only that, they were sophisticated enough to know what messages were likely to perform. The anti-vax movement, which really came into its maturity around 2014, 2015, at least in the US, said, okay, groups are finding out what messages are trusted, but what we need to do is change the messenger. The messenger matters as much as the message. So what they did is they organized individuals that were seemingly credibility. And because they were telling highly personal, emotional, and often local stories, those narratives outcompeted overwhelming amounts of fact-based information from legitimate institutions. And so we saw not only how trusted messages were emerging, or our ability to find them, but we started to understand that if we change the messenger, I'm much more likely to remember a piece of content from Julian than I am from the Network One. And that's what the vax movement taught us. So we get to Russia and something that we're sort of existentially living through today. And the Internet Research Agency and others took what ISIS and others did and they professionalized it. And what they did is they created a real model for always on content. And they understood that all culture was internet culture. And that at some point, everything we do as marketers passes through the prism of the internet. And that there was ability, if you had enough speed and scale, that you could, even with small amounts of content, disrupt marketing. So you go from this moment of, okay, we can identify what messages people already believe. What they were also doing is then finding who are the best messengers. And then they did it in an always on kind of way. And if you think about it, these are not things that seem like extremism, they seem like kind of digital marketing. And then along comes the power of Donald Trump in the media, and he also starts to understand how different channels interconnect, right? So how something that he says can pass into an ecosystem. And there's lots of leaders, we're working in Belarus and to try to understand Lukashenko, and you start to see this play out over and over and over again, that the customer journey is now more mappable, more understandable, more predictable, and more manipulatable than it's ever been before. And that leads us to some really interesting sort of data that I'll start us with, is when we're able to sort of think about those trusted messages, messengers, that information journeying and the things that we just talked about. It's 5 times more viral. It floods the zone, to use a hockey term, in terms of volume. It's far more consistent. And as a result, it's 4 times more likely to be remembered, recalled, and to fall into this bucket of was it persuasive or not, than the same message coming from an institution or an organization. Now, where does that leave us as marketers? I think is the interesting spot, which is overall what we're marketing into is a completely different environment, which is where there's a collapse in trust in not only society, but among consumers. We know consumers don't trust the media in the same way that they did. We know that they deeply distrust ads. I was in a meeting the other day where a 1% click-through rate they were celebrating that as great. We don't trust corporations and brands, and we certainly don't trust government. And that's been a byproduct of this weaponization of the internet, but something that if you think about, I'm creating a campaign and now I'm looking at these stats, boy, I might have to think about how I'm marketing in a different way. And what we learned is that there was both a black and a silver lining to all this, which is people, instead of trusting institutions and organizations and ads and emails, they trust each other. So the study that we did, which has been corroborated by others, is you're 83% more likely to trust another person's opinions, campaigns than campaigns and companies. So we can go back to that analogy about Julian. When he does a piece of content, it's far more impactful than his organizations. Same is true for P&G, same is true for General Motors. And we think that that's got pretty profound implications. So the knee-jerk reaction through all of this has been to gravitate towards this discipline of influencer marketing. And as you can see, this is a piece, if you want to Google Curtis and this title in Ad Age, you'll see that we lay out what we think is a pretty compelling argument as to why influencer marketing doesn't work. While we applaud the effort to seek this authenticity, to convey trust through people that we think our consumers already trust, what we find time and time again is that we don't actually trust influencers. They're not like us, they don't live the same lives, that they're aspirational, that they're cognitively disconnected from us. And what it also reminds us is that in a world that does trying to restore trust, if it takes you 6 people to write a tweet, you're probably in a lot of trouble because the trust is going to erode along the way. So if I pull back the curtain on all this, and these are things that we're saying to brands every day, and they're pretty harsh, but I think they're also pretty real, is consumers are really distrustful of brands. We have time and time again, and I'll drill down on this, seeing that what you want to say as a brand is not what they want to hear. And as they've been able to organize their lives around social and digital media, it's less about them and it's always about me. And as we were going to lay out, people are a medium and a message. If they trust each other, we start to really think about how they inform the message, to create the media, and serve as a primary distribution media. And as I said earlier, whether you're working on the internet, whether you're doing a billboard advertising, whether you're doing television advertising, whether you're doing public relations, it doesn't matter. Everything now passes through this internet, this prism of the internet, and all culture is internet culture. So if you take these in their totality and you start to say, I am now marketing to a consumer that is less likely to trust what I say than ever before in history, where does that leave us? So what we ended up doing at People First and its sister agency, Mainstreet One, one focusing commercial, one focusing on politics, is we built a managed services operation backed by a platform that restores trust, that is focused on online persuasion. So what it essentially does is, through technology originally developed with DARPA to counter Russian, ISIL, and anti-vax extremism, we have the ability to understand what's moving culture and to identify what messages consumers already trust and already believe. We then have the ability, we have a database right now of 6.3 million in the US alone, about 3 million in Europe, to be able to identify people by location, profession, age, race, gender, affinity, identity, ethnicity, to identify who are the trusted messengers that are best equipped to carry a message, because it's not as often to be brands, and then to build the infrastructure and the workflow to be able to do this all with speed and scale, right? So what we notice is, like I said, if it takes you 6 people to open a tweet, very hard to do this. So what we had to do is build out the workflow to allow you to do all of this at kind of the speed of the internet and the speed of culture in highly regulated markets like financial services and pharma and CPG, as well as all the work that we still do in politics. So these 3 things together in a loop, and I'll dig into them, are essentially what our agency does for a profession on behalf of brands ranging from Frito-Lay to J&J to Hartford Insurance, who've all understood that there is a radically different environment in which they're marketing. And if you also get a chance, I think Digiday did a nice piece on Friday about our work, which is making an argument again that influencer marketing, as influencer marketing comes up short, the ability to influence you through your friends and neighbors, the people that share affinities, ethnicities, and geographies is more important than ever. So what does this look like tactically? On the left, you see traditional methodologies of polling and focus groups. And on the right, you look at our tool. And what you realize that in a market of distrust, when you're answering the question, are you going to take your COVID vaccine? Are you going to vote for Boris Johnson? People are not as often. And where they tend to be more honest about themselves is through their expressions online. So again, through the wonders of DARPA, we have some technology that allows us to collect, enrich, and analyze first-party data by geography, by affinity, by any kind of subnovel population to say, what do they already trust? What do they already believe? And what messages are likely to break through? And what this means is that instead of doing traditional market research, right, where people are an object, what we do is place them at the center in a people first way and say they are the message, they inform the message. And when you think about creative, what you're looking at is a cultural campaign, which looks like influencer marketing, but what it really is all patients that suffer from irritable bowel syndrome, who have raised their hands, by the tens and hundreds to say, I'm willing to tell my story about living with a really difficult medical condition. And to do this at enough speed and scale that we can learn as much as we can through traditional methodology, but we can also begin to shift persuasion opinions based on the trust that they convey, not as high-end influencers, as real people sharing real stories about themselves. And I think that's the piece that I would sort of say in all this, is these are people like you and me. These are people that if you reduce it down to its sociological level, who look like, talk like, act like people within my community, because often that they are, we share a zip code, we share a different set of affinities. And from a macro standpoint, where this is leading a lot of what we do and work we do with Salesforce and others, is this idea of fast advertising. So we've done a lot of stuff relating to word of mouth. We talked about how we shift public opinion online, but this also works from an advertising standpoint. So many of you may remember Will Ferrell's ad on behalf of General Motors at the Super Bowl in the United States, where my hometown Kansas City Chiefs lost, by the way. But what was, I think, more remarkable to me was the bottom-up approach that not only brands like Audi took, but the government of Norway, different student groups, who, understanding that this was not a moment of advertising, but this was a moment of culture, took to their iPhones and computers and created counter advertising, what we call fast advertising. Is they listened for what was happening in culture, and they created a response within 48 hours. And if you look at the response, it got 4 times the amount of engagements and views, as did the GM ad, which ran on the most watched television show in the United States. And it just shows you that, again, if you want to understand the future of marketing, you answer a very simple question. What happens when individuals gain more control over the institutions of marketing? And by the way, if you want to add currency, if you want to add government, you want to investment, we're living through this same moment in lots of different sectors. So there's pretty overwhelming evidence that this is happening. Now, what we realized is that if you can create enough moments, right? If you can win enough moments through these types of approaches, you can add up to a movement. But what we learned is that every movement needs an epicenter. So what you're looking at look like very sort of simple websites. The one on the bottom right is actually a campaign that we've been running since March that is identifying what are the attitudes, what messages do we trust about COVID and the conditions of frontline workers and health workers. And then we are sourcing at scale. I mean, we've done more than 1,000 of these, finding doctors, nurses, EMTs, and other frontline workers to tell their story about what the conditions are at the front line in order to shift public opinion. It's 400% more persuasive than the same content done by organizations themselves. And what this allows to do is for marketers, brand marketers, to do something that we call in politics, digital relational organizing, which is a fancy way of summing up everything we've been talking about today, is how you get like-minded individuals to share in unison at scale. And so what we're often doing is creating a hub for this to happen. And you would think that hub would happen in social media, and it does. But social media is actually a really efficient animal because the news feed is always passing, right? So what we are able to do is create kind of we talked about information journey earlier. We're able to set up the digital ecosystem in a way that allows us to perform this type of word of mouth marketing. The example on the left was we launched the first line of clean medicines, stripped of talcs and unnatural dyes and leads and all extraneous ingredients. And the highest performing part of their site is where they're telling personal stories, right? We trust other people, and therefore personal, emotional, local, and visual stories are outperforming traditional marketing and ads by a landslide. And as I mentioned, and this may be kind of the least sexy part of this, but I think was a breakthrough for us, is we needed to be able to continuously A/B test like ISIS. We needed to be able to continuously recruit people to participate in our programs in an authentic, 100% authentic, no bots, no automations, but in a way that the Internet Research Agency does. And we needed to understand a little bit in the Trump world about how you sort of set up the listening apparatus to be able to do this. And so what we did is we created a workflow here that allows us to, see in full transparency which content is performing, drive that into a creative brief, let you see drafts of the content as they flow in so we can copy and art direct, allow you to push go on certain distribution to social and digital channels, and then to see the intake and the feedback of that, all that, and how it's performing, so that, again, we wake up the next day and can do it all over again. Because the one thing that is hardest about this, well, you can have a campaign that has some consistency. I want irritable bowel syndrome patients to tell their personal stories. What we do find is the discourse is shifting at a rate we've never seen before. All of our work in COVID is sort of proving that yesterday is never like today or tomorrow anymore on the internet. And so, as I said, when we get these real people to share real stories based on this first party data, it is more engaged and it's more clicked, right? We see significant higher performance on display, overwhelmingly higher engagement on social channels, such as Instagram, and actually the second number, the 14% is Facebook. And it is on average 300% more persuasive when we do randomized control testing for brands, which we bake into every single project that we do. And so what it ends up is looking like this. And again, this is going to be as slow as fast as a brand is comfortable. But find what consumers already trust and believe. Again, what they want to hear is not what we want to say anymore. Identifying in moments in culture, and those moments in culture could be because the brand did something like using Colin Kaepernick in an ad, or organically happening in a non-branded way. Identify who the trusted messengers are, right? Who will then translate those briefs into their own voice vernacular. We then figure out the information journey to distribute this sort of across the customer journey. We organize the movement, and then we test, we iterate, and we optimize. And understand that this is always going to be changing, right? And that's the exciting part, that we have to win the internet moment. And if we win enough internet moments, like I said, we can create movements and we can create change. And every study that we've seen says whoever has the most breadcrumbs, the most digital breadcrumbs out there, is most likely to have the most sales. So we're increasingly able to draw a connection between, right, your share of voice on the internet, the amount of persuasion you have on the internet, and how you're doing as a business, which gets really exciting because we do work across and up and down the funnel. And that gets really exciting. So again, I think as we think about where brands are going, we're marketing into this very skeptical consumer that I don't see changing anytime soon. So we're looking for new models to restore trust and offer persuasion. So I'm going to pause there and answer a few questions.
So we've had one question from the audience. Fran Valmana has said, "Hi Curtis, how do you manage to deal with those massive people databases, considering, for example, EU's GDPR and or California's CCPA restrictive policies?"
Right. So what we've done is we do a lot of work in California. We've done a decent amount of work in EU. So there's a couple of different ways. It's A, there's a database, but B, what we've also done is figure out a compliance system that allows us to identify individuals based on their profile data online. And then to be able to reach out to you again within regulations, via email, via DM, to recruit you rapidly into campaigns. So we've sort of figured out privacy. And we would say the biggest challenge we have on that front is the inability to share data from the US to the EU and other countries. So we have had to firewall that off so that the European stuff is the European stuff and the American stuff is the American stuff, even if it's for a single brand. But I probably should have said one of the things, because I don't think we're just relying on our database, is the ability to say, okay, I want Welsh single mothers who have pre-existing healthcare conditions, and then to be able to be EU compliant, to look at data and then make it opt-in and invitation only in order to build those rapid networks of word of mouth and content creators.
Thank you, that's great. I've had another question from Martin Albrecht. He said, a question for Curtis, can you talk about what kinds of brands and projects are best suited for your approach, / that you would welcome?
Yeah, so I'd say the ones that we don't do as much for. So I think that there's been areas where influencer marketing is kind of gotten a foothold in areas like fashion and beauty, where there's this very sort of dogmatic view of what peer-to-peer looks like. And so what we don't do is tend to do a lot of that, just because those spaces are, I think, have gone down a path that's sort of philosophically not aligned with us. What's interesting is we are doing more B2B projects. So the idea to find, because again, we have the ability to find CEOs within our network or tech leaders within our network. To be able to do that, we love regulated markets. But really what we're doing is wanting to create specialized audiences. So again, we just did a campaign working with Native Americans across the country to talk about land preservation, land management. And so I really think that what our special sauce and the type of sectors we look with are folks that are looking for sort of hard to get audiences in a way. Not that I want our job to be hard, but those are the sectors in which we really, really thrive. But I think we can work across any sector. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks. Well, that is actually all we've got time for today. Thank you so much. That really was quite a session. And a huge thank you to all of the speakers that we've had. We are now going to take 15 minutes to grab a coffee, take a break if you need one, and then join some of your fellow participants for a quick chat about what you've heard and seen so far. So you'll stay in there in the breakout rooms for about 15 minutes, and then we'll bring you back automatically for one of our last sessions of today, when my colleague Paul Squirrel will be moderating a no-holds-barred discussion between 4 renowned media agency leaders from the US, Canada, UK, and Australia.